We are quite aware that an attempt has been made by several writers on the present position of the Church to vindicate her independence in the matter of her confession by a reference to the Act adopting it in 1647. But such an argument only serves to place the Erastianism of the Revolution's settlement in the strongest light, while in itself it is wholly unworthy of men embarked in a great and righteous cause. For if the privileges and obligations conferred by that act are recognized by the Revolution Church, she must also be considered as holding herself bound by the deeds of the Second Reformation, embodying the national covenant and solemn league into the constitution of the Church, deeds which, though rescinded by the state, have never been ecclesiastically repealed, and she must also be regarded as continuing to recognize the Directory of 1649, anent the election of ministers, as still in force, a measure passed by the Church after patronage had been abolished by the state and annulled only by the Acts Recissory of Charles. But all these, it is too notorious, have gone into long desuetude, and have therefore been practically renounced. It is maintained by certain writers on the church controversy, and here a footnote, the present conflict between the civil and ecclesiastical courts examined by the Reverend Andrew Gray, the present position of the Church of Scotland explained and vindicated by John Hamilton, page 33. That a statutory recognition of the confession as previously belonging to the Church by her own proper deed is contained in the following words of the Act of Settlement. Likewise they, by these presents, ratify and establish the confession of faith, now read in their presence, and voted and approven by them as the public and avowed confession of this Church, and peculiar emphasis is therefore laid on them by printing them in italics and capitals. We have no objection whatever that the words, as the public and avowed confession of this Church, should be blazoned forth in this attractive style, were it to serve no other purpose than to fix attention on the extreme ambiguousness of the expression. It forcibly reminds one of the vaticinations of the ancient oracle, which were so cunningly contrived and expressed, that whether the particular event in question proved fortunate or adverse, the response might bear a construction consistent with the fact, and thus the credit of the unseen and mysterious power be maintained unimpaired in the estimation of its hoodwinked votaries. And notwithstanding all the ingenuity, legal and clerical, which had been expended on this point, we humbly conceive that ample room is still left for raising the question, whether according to the terms of the Act we are to understand that the State voted and approved the confession because it was the public and avowed confession of the Church, or was it declared to be the public and avowed confession of the Church because it was voted and approved as such by the State. We are constrained to conclude, notwithstanding the ambiguousness of the expression, that it was pronounced to be the public and avowed confession of the Church because it was first voted and approved as such by the Parliament. The terms of the statute do not run, they ratify and establish the public and avowed confession of this Church, now read in their presence and voted and approved as containing them, etc. But they are as follows, quote, they ratify and establish the confession of faith, now read in their presence, and voted and approved by them as the public and avowed confession of this Church, unquote. Besides, it is worthy of notice that this construction is supported by the well-known Erastianism of William and his Parliament, and is in perfect harmony with all the ecclesiastical arrangements of that memorable era, while the other interpretation is at variance with both. The attempt to show from the expression in question that the Act of Settlement Parliament acknowledged the spiritual independence of the Church might be tolerated in the pleadings of a lawyer straining every nerve in his client's behalf, although it would be very hazardous to his case to adduce such an argument in its support. But such a plea becomes quite unseemly when put forward by grave and learned divines. But furthermore, the Act of Settlement does not ratify the Confession of Faith as originally adopted by the Reformed Church of Scotland. It was embraced by her in the state in which she received it from her commissioners to the Westminster Assembly, in which it was prepared. But in 1690, instead of being ratified entire, its doctrinal articles alone were sanctioned, and the Scripture proofs omitted. These proofs were, to all intents and purposes, an integral part of the instrument. They were considered so by the Westminster Assembly and the English Parliament. Here a footnote. Stevenson's History, Book 3, Chapter 9, as well as Bailey's Letters, Volume 2, page 251. And they were adopted as such by the Church of Scotland in 1647, but the Revolution Parliament of William and Mary mutilated the document by omitting them. It will not do to say, as we have heard it done, that as all the chapters are ratified and transferred to the statute book, the omission is of little consequence, the Scripture proofs not being in every instance the most appropriate that could be employed. Had the alteration been effected by the judgment and authority of the Church, such a statement might perhaps have some weight in it. But what right had the state, even though the change were an improvement, to alter in the most minute particular the confession of the Church? It could not do so without an assumption of power that does not belong to it, and seriously encroaching on the spiritual jurisdiction of the Church. Nevertheless, this mutilated confession was voted and approved by it, as the public and avowed confession of the Church then established, and it is well that the act so ratifying it has at least the honesty to speak of it, neither as the Westminster Confession, nor as the Confession of the Church of Scotland before the Restoration, but simply as the Confession now read, in the presence of Parliament, and as containing the sum and substance of the doctrines of the Reformed Churches. It is true that the Confession distinctly recognizes the headship of Christ over the Church, and declares that he hath therein appointed a government in the hand of church officers, distinct from the civil magistrate. But at the same time we cannot avoid the conclusion that these very doctrines were violated and overborne by the state in the act of settlement, and that the Church, by receiving from the state the form of government and confession thus ratified, without any complaint or remonstrance, and without adopting them in the exercise of her own intrinsic powers, homologated this unwarrantable stretch of authority, surrendered the dearest rights of the daughter of Zion, and humbled herself at the feet of the secular power. Number 3. In the next place, we shall advert to the interference of the state in the Revolution settlement with the discipline of the Church and the constitution of her judicatories. All persons acquainted with the history of the period are aware that at the commencement of the Second Reformation, the Church, in the exercise of her own inherent authority, determined in whose hands the keys of the government should be placed, and adopted vigorous and decisive measures for inflicting merited censure on adherents of prelacy, as well as on all who were immoral in their lives or erroneous in their doctrine. Here a footnote. Proceedings of the Assembly held in Glasgow in 1638. But at the Revolution, the state took this matter under its own control. The Act of Parliament 1690 declares that the church government shall be established by the hands of and exercised by those Presbyterian ministers who were outed for nonconformity to prelacy since the 1st of January, 1661, and such ministers and elders only as they have admitted or received. Here, then, the state appointed the rulers of the Revolution Church, thus sustaining itself as the source of ecclesiastical authority. The Presbyterian Church, be it recollected, was then in a state of total disorganization, without a constitution and without courts, so that it is obvious that it was constituted anew and reorganized at the dictation of the civil power.